during my postdoctorate studies at Harvard in 2003. Sometimes went to his classes, always participated in the seminars where he was and impressed by the wide knowledge that he had. Professor has been at Harvard for many, many years. He has done his studies there, his PhD is from Harvard, and then he's been there at the faculty since 1972. That's at Harvard University, being for many years. He's known for his scholarly work, extensive publications in referee journals and books. And with this, I would like to hand over to the session chair and chairman of EGROW Foundation, Dr. Virmani. Just to mention that professor is talking about his new book today, Religion and the Rights of Capitalism, and we are all looking forward to listening to him. Over to Dr. Virmani, please.
Thank you, Charan. Well, it's a real honor and a personal pleasure for me to welcome Professor Benjamin Friedman to this seminar, EGROW seminar. So I will, at my age, we start thinking of our old associations. So let me start by telling a little story from my PhD time. So I had got Professor Kenneth Arrow to become my thesis supervisor, and I had suggested to him that could we have Marty Feldstein, who later became a good friend of ours because he used to visit India a lot. But he was on a leave of absence. So Professor Arrow suggested that we get Dale Jorgensen for the empirical part of my thesis. And then a day later, he said, "Oh, would you mind if we got Professor Benjamin Friedman also?" I said, "That's great. Who would be very useful." So that's how I got Professor Friedman as my thesis supervisor. But out of the three, of course, I met Professor Arrow a couple of times later. But for a long time, I didn't meet Ben Friedman. And I think that after a big gap, I met him about 10 or 15 years ago at a Harvard seminar. And I remember you mentioned Litauer Center. I came to visit you there and had the pleasure. You took me out for lunch, I think it was, at the club, Harvard Club, or your faculty club. But Professor Friedman, his academic stuff is there, but I really think he's one of the finest persons, and I really enjoyed always talking to him and being with him. So without further ado, Ben, please, it's all yours.
Thank you, Arvind, and it's a great honor for me to participate in this seminar for the new foundation. I wish the new foundation well, and I think it's a wonderful enterprise that all of you have begun. And it's also a treat to see so many old friends on the screen, Suman Berry and Charan Singh, whom we enjoyed very much having with us at Harvard nearly 20 years ago now, and Arvind, who was one of my very first PhD students. Arvind,
oh, really?
I would have to look it up, Arvind, but it's even possible that you may have been the first student whose dissertation committee I served on. I'm not sure whether that's true. Now, two procedural things before we get going. One, I want to be able to share some slides. So, and I'm not used to doing this on WebEx. So can somebody tell me what I do in order to get share slides? I see a share function. Maybe let's do that. And well, let's. Okay. Are you seeing slides on the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, good. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me get these up. All right. So why don't I begin, and following Charan's instructions, I'll plan to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I will be very glad to answer questions and entertain discussion. As Charan has already mentioned, and Arvind too, I'm speaking here about my latest book, which just came out in January, called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. The central question that I undertake in this book is to understand where our modern Western economics came from. I want to know why it emerged when it did. And to be specific, what I have in mind in looking for the origins of modern Western economics is what we usually call the first fundamental welfare theorem. It's the proposition that individuals acting merely on their own self-interest with no altruism involved can, and under the right circumstances will, wind up making other people better off in addition to just themselves. Now, among economists today, we of course think of this as just natural, and we probably don't devote a great deal of time pondering why that's so. But if we pause and step back from it a moment, this is really a very, very profound insight, and it has remained the centerpiece of modern Western economics for now a quarter of a millennium. The usual presumptions of where this idea came from are two. First, people point to Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. Donald Winch, alas, no longer with us, but I would say Winch was the greatest Adam Smith scholar of our lifetimes. Winch pointed to The Wealth of Nations as what he called the fountainhead of all of classical political economy. And the second usual presumption is that because Adam Smith and David Hume and the other people of that era who gave us modern Western economics were products of the Enlightenment, in particular the Scottish Enlightenment, we therefore think of economics as a movement away from notions of a God-centered universe to what we, in our modern vocabulary, call secular humanism. To cite another Smith scholar in his prize-winning book on Smith from about 10 years ago, Nick Phillipson referred to not just The Wealth of Nations, but Smith's entire corpus of work as what he said was built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's quintessential assault on religion. And I don't think Phillipson was saying anything that he deemed to be new or unusual. In this regard, he was just repeating the usual presumptions. Well, in my book, I very much accept the first part of this. I agree that Adam Smith is the father of our subject and that the central work, for reasons I will explain, is The Wealth of Nations. But I quite straightforwardly reject the second of these two presumptions. And instead, while of course I recognize that Smith and Hume were part of the Scottish Enlightenment, my core argument is that their economic thinking was powerfully inspired and enabled by what were then new and very contentious and hotly contended lines of religious thinking in the English-speaking Protestant world of which they were a part. In particular, I believe that it was the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism that opened up for them a new, more optimistic, more benign view of the human character and an greatly expanded view of the opportunities and the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. And I argue in the book that it's this central religious impulse that gave us modern Western economics as we know it. Now, I want to clear up one potential misunderstanding right at the beginning. I am not suggesting that any of this had to do with religiously committed individuals self-consciously bringing their religious beliefs to bear on their professional work. Smith and Hume and others of this period became international celebrities within their own lifetimes. And as a result, we know a lot biographically about these men. And for both Smith and Hume in particular, it would be quite absurd to claim that they were religiously committed individuals trying to bring their religious beliefs to bear on their work. Hume, for example, was a notorious, outspoken opponent of any kind of organized religion. Hume used to refer to Church of England bishops as retainers to superstition. His phrase, everybody understood that he was at the very best a skeptic and agnostic. Many people, including me, think he was an atheist. Even though everybody understood that he was the leading figure in the Scottish Enlightenment because of his religious atheism, he was never able to secure an academic appointment at any Scottish university. His great friend William Robertson, who was the head of the Church of Scotland, used to refer to him as a heathen. Smith was much more private about his personal religious beliefs, but there's no evidence to think that Smith had any firm religious commitments. He was probably the kind of deist that we in America think of as like Benjamin Franklin of that era or Thomas Jefferson. So what then was the story? The central concept that I appeal to in the book is one that I take from Einstein, called in Einstein's German, it was the Bild der Welt, worldview. Einstein famously argued that scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought, but that leaves the question of what the pre-scientific thought amounts to. And here's what Einstein had to say on the subject. You can read it. Einstein's view was that the world is just too complex, and we are not going to make progress in understanding the world if we frontally assault it. Instead, what we do is form in our own minds a simplified image of the world, again, Bild der Welt in Einstein's German, and we then apply our analysis to that simplified image. An economist might say we analyze the model rather than the world. And Einstein, interestingly, pointed not just to physical scientists, but he pointed to poets here, he pointed to painters, he pointed to philosophers. Philosophers is important in this context because, as I assume everybody knows, Smith was not an economist. The word didn't even exist in Smith's day. Smith was a professor of moral philosophy. Now, am I on firm ground in applying this Einstein idea to economics? Several of my predecessors in my own department certainly thought so. Schumpeter, in his great survey, argued that before any economist sits down to do his or her analysis, the person has in mind what Schumpeter called a pre-analytic vision. And incidentally, the capital V on vision there is not mine. That's the way Schumpeter wrote it. My dear friend and much missed colleague, Ken Galbraith, argued that economic ideas are, as he put it, always and intimately a product of their own time and place. And so my argument today is going to be that Adam Smith and David Hume, in this Einstein, Schumpeter, Galbraith way, proceeded from what we can call a worldview, what we can call their pre-analytic vision, and that vision was very much a part of, created by the religious thinking of their day. Now, let's be clear for the moment about what the change was in religious thinking that Smith and Hume gave us. If we go back to 1700, I would summarize economic thinking. I put economic in quotation marks here because, to repeat, there was no such thing as economics then. But economic thinking I would summarize in three propositions. First, could individuals correctly perceive what it was in their own self-interest to do in the economic sphere? And the answer was probably not. And for that reason, it was deemed to be essential to run an economy on a top-down basis. The English had all of these government-granted monopolies. The French had their mercantilist system. Other countries had various forms of what we would think of as dirigist systems. But even more centrally, for the purpose of what modern Western economics became, even if people understood what it was in their own self-interest to do, as of 1700, there was no presumption that their acting on their self-interest in the economic sphere made anybody other than themselves better off. And for this reason, the standard words applied to acting on your own self-interest, if it was a noun, this was taken to be a vice. For an adjective, this was taken to be vicious. In short, acting on your own self-interest in the economic sphere was taken to be morally opprobrious. If we skip forward to 1790, I picked 1790 because that's the year in which Adam Smith died. We're now 14 years after the great book. The book had by now gone through 6 editions in English, a whole bunch of foreign translations. Can individuals correctly perceive their self-interest in the economic sphere? Smith assumed yes, they can. Interestingly, Smith assumed they can when they're acting as producers of goods and services. Smith was very careful, a thinker, and he did not assume that when people act as consumers. Indeed, to the contrary, Smith famously has lots of scathing comments about the foolishness and frivolousness of consumption choices among the rich. But like a careful mathematician who wants to assume no more than what he absolutely needs in order to prove his theorem, Smith saw that all he needed to get his proposition established was that people get it right when they act as producers, and so that's what he assumed. Second, and most importantly, Smith absolutely had it that when people act on their own self-interest under the right conditions, they will make others better off as well as themselves. And as we all know, Smith showed us that those conditions are competition carried out in markets. And third, for that reason, by the time we get to the Wealth of Nations, the entire vocabulary of vice and vicious is simply gone. Those words do appear in the Wealth of Nations, but never to refer to merely acting on your own self-interest. Now, it is true that Smith had intellectual precursors in this line of thought, and we can talk about some of them if you like. I've listed here some of the more important ones in France and in England. France is important in this context, because Smith lived there in France for 2.5 years when he was just starting out on this project. So we have to confront right at the beginning whether perhaps one of these people, or maybe some combination of them, deserve the credit instead of Smith. Maybe people like us should think of Pierre Nicole in France, or Bernard Mandeville as the father of economics. My answer to that question is no. These people do not get credit instead of Smith. And the reason is that although they had some intuitions of this idea, none of them had any understanding of how the proposition came about. In particular, they had no notion of the role of markets. They had no notion of the role of competition. And we might say, okay, maybe they didn't have our explanation for the first welfare theorem. they're allowed to have some other proof of the theorem, but they didn't. They had no other mechanism to suggest at all. And especially for a generation of intellectuals, all of whom had been trained in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism, this just wasn't going to fly. Newton's great book, the Principia Mathematica, had been published in 1687. By the time Smith was an undergraduate in the 1730s, the book was part of the standard curriculum at every Scottish university. It was part of the standard curriculum at Cambridge. Interestingly, not at Oxford, and maybe that's why Oxford lagged behind Cambridge for so long in scientific endeavor. But all of these figures that we look at in the Scottish Enlightenment were trained in Newtonian ideas, and therefore they said for their purposes it just wouldn't work to think as people like Nicole and Mandeville had. So let's be explicit now about Smith's argument in The Wealth of Nations. I would summarize it in 4 pieces. First, Smith just assumed that our desire for material gain is inborn and therefore no more morally opprobrious than the fact that we have to eat or that we have to breathe. Smith has this lovely passage in The Wealth of Nations in which he says that the desire to better our condition, that's the way he puts it, to better our condition, comes with us from the womb and stays with us until the grave, and in between there's scarcely an instant in which it's not working on us. Now, of course, bettering our condition could mean lots of different things, but he immediately goes on to make clear that it's our economic condition, our standard of living that we want to better. Second, Smith places at the center of his mechanism the role of competitively set prices and wages. That's what steers the economy to the right place. And if you go back and look at The Wealth of Nations, and in the book I point you to some of the more interesting passages for this purpose, it is striking how Newtonian the language is with which Smith describes this operation. He could just as well be referring to planets circling around the sun. Of course, he's not. He's referring to economic activity being moved by these prices and wages. Third, because they're competitive, Smith is very clear that these wages and prices are simply the outcomes of two-sided bargains in which on each side people are merely trying to further their self-interest. The sellers, including the sellers of labor, are simply trying to get the highest price they can. The buyers, including the buyers of labor, the employers are simply trying to get the lowest price they can. And for this reason, fourth, Smith repeatedly portrays competitive markets as a prime example of the standard Enlightenment principle of unintended and unforeseen consequences. And this, of course, is the first welfare theorem. This is what has come down to us as the invisible hand. And even that is somewhat interesting. Smith himself did not make did not attach much importance to the phrase. He used it only once in each of his books, but we know this idea as the invisible hand. We think of it in economics as the first welfare theorem. Here is the statue of Adam Smith that stands in the market square today in Edinburgh. This is right across from where Smith's office was when he was a commissioner on the Board of Trade. The sculptor, Sandy Stoddard, I got to have dinner with him one night when I was on a research trip to Edinburgh, very nice man. Stoddard put lots of symbolism in the statue. I don't have time to go through all of it, but I'll just point to one. If you look at the hands in the statue, you'll notice that you can easily see Smith's left hand, but you can't make out the right hand. and that is not an artifact of the angle from which I took the picture. That's built into the statue. No matter where you stand, you cannot see the right hand, and that's Stoddard's way of representing the invisible hand. And so, as we all know, because of Smith's belief that behavior carried out in markets leads to these globally beneficial outcomes, making other people better off as well as ourselves, Smith was famously opposed to impediments to the market mechanism. He was opposed to mercantilism. He was opposed to the English monopolies. He was also opposed to collusive behavior by businessmen. Lots of passages in The Wealth of Nations about how business people try to collude. We could also think of Smith as the father of what in America we call antitrust policy, what in Europe they call competitive policy. But before going on, I just want to make sure everybody is aware that Smith was never the rigorous ideologue on this subject by which he is portrayed by many political conservatives today. Smith did not see the market mechanism as some kind of fragile hothouse flower that needed to be carefully nursed and protected against all possible encroachments. Instead, what impressed Smith was the overwhelming robustness of the market mechanism. And for that reason, when there was a valid public purpose, Smith was very willing to accept a whole variety of restrictions on the market mechanism as long as he thought there was a good purpose. So just to list a few, Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes. Most conservatives today would not have you believe that. I don't know if in India people wear Adam Smith neckties, but they do here. And so my request to you is that next time you see some economist wearing an Adam Smith necktie, you should go up to the person and say, I'm so pleased to see that you're in favor of progressive income taxes, because the overwhelming likelihood is that the person will have no idea what you're talking about, because typically people who wear Adam Smith neckties are people who have heard of The Wealth of Nations but never read it. But Smith absolutely was in favor of progressive income taxes. Smith was in favor of luxury taxes. He thought that people who rode around in expensive carriages should be made to pay special taxes on them. And he was explicit that the taxes should or the revenue should go for relief of the poor. So think of that as saying that people who drive around in Rolls Royces and Mercedeses today should pay special taxes. Smith was in favor of taxes on whiskey and distilleries. That's pretty bold for somebody who lived in Scotland. Smith was also in favor of regulation on banks, much tighter regulation. I don't know about India, but certainly much tighter regulation on banks than anything we've known in the United States in my lifetime. And even though he did not have the vocabulary of externalities, he clearly understood the concept of an externality. And so when, for example, when he's defending his strong recommendation for regulation on banks, he says that he favors these restrictions for the same reason that he favors the laws in Edinburgh that require people to put firewalls between the row houses. Well, it's obviously an externality, although he doesn't call it that. Now, so much for Smith. The central question to repeat in my new book is, what is it that enabled Smith and his contemporaries like Hume and his predecessors to a limited extent to come to this insight? Well, several ingredients are pretty obvious. I've already alluded to some of them. First was their training in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. Smith was also well trained in Stoic philosophy. His favorites were Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Stoic philosophy is a lot about natural harmony in the universe, and so it would have been natural for him to think that if I do something that I think is in my interest, it might make you better off, and if you do something, it might make me better off. Smith lived in what was becoming an increasingly commercial society. He lived in Glasgow, he lived in Edinburgh, he lived in London, he knew merchants there, and he was a very observant man. And he was also a very thoughtful philosopher. Again, he was a professor of moral philosophy, and in both his books, especially in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but in The Wealth of Nations too, there's a lot of introspection. But I think the key additional ingredient is these changes in religious thinking that were underway in the English-speaking Protestant world. Interestingly, in a kind of rolling way, the key change I had in mind was at its height in England in the latter part of the 17th century. It was at its height in Scotland in the early to mid decades of the 18th century, when, to repeat, Smith and Hume were coming to young adulthood and forming their worldview, their pre-analytic vision. And it was at its height in America in the latter part of the 18th century, which not coincidentally is when the founding fathers created the republic in which I happen to live, but that's a different story. So what I have in mind in particular is the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. There were many elements of that that don't bear on economic thinking, but I think there were three elements of this historic turn in the religion of the English-speaking Protestant world that do bear importantly on economic thinking of the day. One have to do with human nature, a second, human destiny in the sense of where are we all going in the afterlife, and third, human purpose. So let me be explicit about each of these three and how they bore on the development of modern economics. First, in terms of human nature, Calvin preached that all individuals are born utterly depraved. That's Calvin phrase. Why? As a result of the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. To continue quoting Calvin, humans are unable to tell good from bad, right from wrong, good from evil. Humans are unable to do any good in the world. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists thought that all humans are born with an inherent goodness. To use John Locke's famous metaphor, they're born with the candle of the Lord. That's the way Locke put it, the candle of the Lord, meaning reason, if they can only take advantage of it. So a very different view of the human character. In terms of human destiny, what predestination meant is that when people worried, as represented in this famous triptych by Memling, when people worried whether they were going to be among the elect who were saved and therefore sent over here on Judgment Day, or whether they were going to be put in the damned and condemned to eternal punishment over here. This was a decision, according to Calvin, that had been made not only before people were born, but before the world was even created. And therefore it followed that there was nothing a person could do in his or her lifetime, no choice a person could make, no action a person could take that would affect this decision. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists believed that everybody is potentially able to be saved, and most importantly, that the choices we make and the actions that we take in our lifetimes are causally efficacious with respect to this crucial decision. To put it in the language of John Tillotson, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, people are able to cooperate with the divine in achieving their salvation. So it's a whole new view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. And then finally, in terms of the reasons why we are all here, Calvin taught that the sole reason that all of us are here is simply the glorification of God. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists believe that human happiness is at the very least one divinely intended reason why we're here, and maybe the most important one, and maybe even the most exclusive one. And therefore, for the post-Calvinists, it wasn't surprising that human institutions, like markets, were designed in order to achieve human ends. Now, to repeat, this debate was absolutely at its height in Scotland during Smith's and Hume's young adulthood. But even so, as I mentioned before, these were not religiously committed individuals. And so I want to end by entertaining quite frontally the question of why these strands of religious thinking would have mattered so much for individuals who were not themselves religiously committed people. I want to point to three reasons. First, they lived in a society in which religion was more important, more pervasive, more multidimensional than anything we know in our society today. Religion was the source of all educational institutions. Oxford, Cambridge, all Scottish universities were religious foundations. Incidentally, Harvard was in those days as well. I already mentioned that Hume was unable to get a university appointment because he was an atheist. In terms of patronage and politics, the Scots, as I'm guessing people in this group already know, the Scots had given up their role as an independent country in 1707. So they no longer had an independent parliament and all of the patronage opportunities that go with that. But what they retained was their separate church. So there was lots of opportunities for patronage in the church, and religion was a very important part of their politics. Second, I think we all know that the Scottish Enlightenment was famous as a period of intense intellectual activity, and that's right. But it's important to remember that intellectual activity in those days was much more integrated than anything we know today. So consider, for example, university faculties and curriculum. Here is a complete listing of the professors at the University of Glasgow when Smith was a professor there. It was a small faculty. There were only 14 of them. Smith, as I've already mentioned, was the professor of moral philosophy, but they also had a theologian. He was the professor of divinity. They had a church historian. The theologian and the church historian served right there on the same faculty with Smith, and it was a small one. Now, contrast that at least with universities in my country today. Harvard has a very distinguished divinity school. We have theologians, we have church historians, but we separate them in this thing called the divinity school, which is located a half a mile away. At Yale, they have a distinguished divinity school that's located a mile away, and the University of Chicago, all sorts of other places. In Smith and Hume's day, the divinity school wasn't separate. They were right there. Theologians were right there in the same faculty. Edinburgh and Glasgow at this time were famous for their intellectual and dining and debate societies. The most distinguished of these was called the Select society. Here's a listing of the 31 members, the original members of the Select Society. Both Smith and Hume were members, but 5 of the 31 were Church of Scotland clergymen, including their friend Robertson, who was head of the church. So that when Smith and Hume dined, as they would have said, with their intellectual friends, the people they were dining with included Church of Scotland ministers. And for that matter, Robertson is a very interesting character. Robertson was simultaneously the head of the Church of Scotland and the principal, in modern language, the president of the University of Edinburgh. So it would be as if the president of my university were simultaneously the president of Harvard and the head of the Episcopal Church, or a Roman Catholic bishop, or the head of the Conference of American Rabbis, or something like that. Well, he isn't, but Robertson was. And then finally, in a way that I'm guessing people in India will recognize, but we in America have a hard time realizing, at this time, religious debate was contentious in a way that, again, in America, we simply do not know. These were ideas that people fought over and died over. So going back to the previous century, the 30 Years' War on the continent between the Catholics and the Protestants was deadlier compared to the size of Europe's population than either World War I or World War II. The English Civil War, which was not between Catholics and Protestants, but about what kind of Protestant they were supposed to be. The English Civil War had likewise been deadlier compared to the size of England's population than World War I or World War II, and that was fought within the lifetime of Smith and Hume's grandfathers. The Highland Rebellion in Scotland, which was again partly about religion. We read today all of these Sir Walter Scott novels, and we think of the Highland Rebellion as this marvelously romantic episode, Bonnie Prince Charlie and all of that sort of thing. It was mighty deadly. People died. Here's a representation of the Battle of Kaloden. A lot of this fighting took place right outside of Edinburgh, and it was 1745. Smith was 22 years old. He could not possibly have not paid attention. And then, to repeat, there was this strong substantive coherence between the new religious ideas and the new economic ideas. So to conclude, I believe that what Smith and his contemporaries were doing were secularizing the dominant religious thinking of their time and their place, which was part of their worldview, part of their Schumpeterian vision, including this more benign and optimistic view of the human character, an expansive view of the possibilities for human choice and human agency. And I think today this is still what economics is about. What do we do as economists? We still think about and analyze human choices and the possibilities for what happens when people choose as they do. The first fundamental welfare theorem is still the absolute heart of our analytical apparatus. And I think if you scratch any economist, you're going to get this more expansive, more optimistic view of the human enterprise. And especially in the United States, and I narrate in the second half of the book a lot of this history, especially in the United States, even as the economy evolved and the questions that people asked changed, I think this from the bottom up influence of the religious thinking on the economic thinking resonated within the subject right down through the 19th and the 20th centuries. And today we still see it, and I'm happy to go into detail if people want. We still see it today in America in our public conversation about economics and our debate over economic policy. So to conclude, yes, of course, economics was and remains a product of the Enlightenment, but that doesn't mean that religion had nothing to do with it. I think the new religious thinking of that time, namely the move away from Orthodox Calvinism, was and remains a central part of that story. And I think this continues to be a part of economic thinking, especially in the US today, and especially in our public conversation. So let me finish there, and Arvind or Charan or Suman, whoever, I'm glad to turn things back to you. If you tell me how to stop sharing my screen, I'm glad to do it.
I think you just need to turn it off. Just click on what you clicked share, it should go off. Yeah. Okay.
I think I did. I think I did.
Okay, great. Okay, so
back to you.
Right, thank you. That's great. You know, it's I'm not, but I'm going to take a stab at it. I'm going to, I think you raised a lot of things which I haven't thought about for a long time. I mean, I did in my college days read philosophy and all those things, but it's it's not an expert view, but I do want to lay out what I think is the Indian contrast, and then we can open it up for questions and comments and so on. So here is how, from my little knowledge about India, you know, firstly, I think Indian society and culture is very religious historically. I mean, it's deeply, every aspect of culture has some religious aspect to it. However, on independence, it seems like we jumped from there to what became a kind of ideal was a secular intellectualism. And we adopted, you know, the kind of leftist, communist, socialist idea, our intellectuals did. And we've been stuck with them, and then we evolved into something called bureaucratic socialism, which I call bureaucratic socialism, where over time, the intellectual elements got diluted, and kind of the bureaucratic elements, including tax evasion, corruption, etc., all evolved because there was no moral, you know, or religious content to it. You know, this a-religious, amoral, Marxian or whatever British socialist ideas. So at this point in time, I think we are, since 91, and I think the second stage we've just done, we are beginning to make that journey back. Now, the point I want to just mention here is that in some sense, our religion, our traditional religion, you know, over millennia, is actually more individualistic, of the kind you mentioned as going post-Calvinist. I mean, as I said, this is my uninformed, you know, as a general observer view, that our religious traditions were actually quite individualist, and we imposed this kind of a-religious, amoral, socialist, whatever you want to call it, secular structure of our intellectuals, kind of rejected that whole religious grounding and went for these ideas. So the interesting thing looking forward, I mean, I'm just giving it, you know, you can't become an instant expert on India, but just to give you a little background. The interesting thing will be now whether what I feel is our individualistic religion, and which is you know, very deep and essential part of most Indians' lives, will now support this movement towards a more, you know, competitive, market-oriented type of system. But you don't have to answer now. You know, we'll just go into questions. You might just want to keep it in the back of your mind as other people come in. Yeah.
Well, I won't answer because I don't
go
know
ahead.
But let me observe though that I think you're raising a very interesting point. And I think it would be extremely interesting if some Indian intellectual, who would also have to be an economist, so you have to have somebody who knows about two things, which I worked very hard to do in this book, I think there's a book to be written in this vein about India, about exactly what you said, because as India now moves away from the Marxist socialist residue of the Nehru era, India is going to be evolving its own form of market capitalism. And we should not be arrogant enough to think that it's going to be an exact replica of what we have in the United States. It isn't. It's going to be distinctively Indian. And as it emerges, it will be very interesting to see whether the distinctive Indian features have something to do with the Indian religious influence in the way that in my book, I argue that our capitalism in the United States reflects our religious backgrounds. That's a different book to be written. And I am absolutely not the person who's capable of writing it, but I hope somebody does.
Right, right. Excellent suggestion. Very useful point. I would just add that, in some sense, you mentioned during your talk about regulation. We also have, both the right regulations and the wrong ones, so to say. And but looking forward, I think the key point is going to be where we may contribute actually completely new things is this whole new digital world, so to say, the social media, given the large size of the population, given that the government is quite active in creating the public goods and infrastructure of the digital world. And I think here, perhaps, like you said, we may be contributing to how the regulatory system of how the markets, the digital markets involved. But yes, I think that's a very good point. Suman is the kind of person who may want to write such a book, but I don't know. Anyway, Suman, do you want to open
up? Ben, I think what Arvind has said is very profound and important because, we have a predestinarian philosophy in Hinduism, but we also venerate profit. I mean, there is this phrase, Shubh Labh, which is integral to the Indian religious view of individual activity. But I don't want to take this any further, but I accept that there is a trove there to be mined. I wanted to ask two questions, if I could. One, what moved you to write this book? Because this would be relevant for a possible Indian book. And second, your description of Calvinism was interesting to me. And yet we also had, as it were, an evolution in the Netherlands from a Calvinist, if you like, origin to a tolerant capitalist society. So I'm just, since you know the Netherlands well, I'm just interested and intrigued to know at what the machinery was in different parts of Europe in shedding, as it were, the shackles of Calvinism, because you make it sound as though this was essentially pioneered in Scotland, but I think you'd agree this was happening elsewhere in Europe as well, no?
No,
okay.
Yeah. Well, so let me take your two questions, Suman. Thank you very much. First, as to why I wrote the book, I didn't come at it from the side of religious thinking. I came at it from the side of an economist. And what I wanted, I've always been interested in why ideas in general emerge when and where they do. So what I was wanting to do was to understand the origins of modern Western economics. But as I explored that question, I kept stumbling over influences of religious thinking. If you go back to my previous book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, there are two chapters on the intellectual history of two pretty long chapters, actually, on the intellectual history of these ideas connecting economics and moral evolution in society. And when I wrote those two chapters, I just kept again and again and again coming across a role for religious thinking. And in that book, I didn't have the time or space to explore those carefully. But when I finished that book, I thought this was worth going for. And so that's what I did. But again, I came at it not from the perspective of somebody who's interested in the first instance in religious thinking and then looking for an influence of that. I came at it from the perspective of an economist wanting to know where economic ideas came from and then wanting to follow where that led me, and it led me back to this evolution in religious thinking. Now, it is not true that the Scots pioneered the movement away from Calvinism. In fact, they were a bit, as I trace out in a significant chunk of the book, Calvinism was not the original Protestant impulse. The original Reformation was associated with Luther and when in Germany, and when Protestantism came to England, it originally did not come in Calvin's form. But over the course of the 16th and then on into the 17th century, increasingly Calvinist principles became dominant in the English-speaking Protestant world, and also in some places on the continent. I think, for example, of Geneva, where Calvin lived. I think of the Netherlands, but not in Germany, not in Scandinavia. They remained Lutheran. Now, the movement back, and this was not a uniform view. Again, as I indicate in the book, this was hotly contended. Calvinism was argued over on the way in, and it was argued over on the way out. So it was never uniform. But the movement away from Calvinism did not start in Scotland. It started in England. And that's in part what the English Civil War in the 1640s was about. The Puritan side, the Calvinist side won. And what I call the high tide of Calvinism in the English-speaking world was in the 1640s and 1650s under Oliver Cromwell. In effect, it was a religious dictatorship. And then when the Cromwell regime collapsed in 1660, then England started moving away from predestinarian Calvinism, and that movement in England was pretty well complete by the end of the 17th century. But then it took place later in Scotland, and then the Scots didn't pioneer it. The Scots then had the similar movement in the early to mid decades of the 18th century, and then in the United States, because we started off, at least in New England, as a Puritan Commonwealth. Here it was in the latter part of the 18th century. So we can't really look for the movement away from Calvinism in other parts of Europe, because with the exception of the Netherlands, they never had Calvinism, or I guess Geneva, but Geneva was special because that's where Calvin lived. So it really has to be an English-speaking world. But then it just so happens that it was the English-speaking world that gave us modern Western economics. So if modern Western economics had come from the Germans, the whole story would be different, I assume. But it isn't.
Right.
We got it from Smith and Hume.
Thanks.
So, yeah, Suman, you have follow-up. I want to just come in a minute before I come to Charan. Yeah, I think Suman was right to remind me, but it's not, rebirth is not predestination. You know, what the Indian philosophy or religion or whatever you want to call it really was to explain your position when you're born. So that was explained on the basis of your past births, but you had the agency to do the good or bad in this life to determine your future. So it's, it's quite different. It's quite different from predestination.
Yeah, that would be the opposite of what Calvin meant by predestination.
That's right. Because what they were trying to do is have a harmonious society so that people don't revolt. I mean, if you want to put it crudely, that, okay, accept where you are, do whatever you can, do the best you can, and then you'll move up. And at the end of this process, you will have moksha, that you'll be freed of the cycle completely. So it's a very, very different way of looking at it. And I still think, the observation then you made a very pertinent observation that'll be interesting to see if this type of conception can lead to, a different thinking or a different model or so on. Anyway, so Charan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, Professor, I like that slide in which you mentioned about Adam Smith and the taxing the rich, regulating the banks, taxing liquor. Now, one of the thoughts that comes to my mind is, what was the motivation that, and these are two, three different things, like what was the motivation that Smith would prescribe that you tax the rich? Was it an egalitarian society? Income inequalities that even today we talk of? When he says about the liquor and that part, what was the motivation there? And the third, the banks, means the banks weren't very well developed at that time. They were pretty local and small. And was there a huge long history of collapse of banks that he's saying that we should be regulating them, keeping in mind exactly the point that you made, that the political powers were probably in England and the Scots were probably just having the religious power. So just wanted to have your thoughts on this.
Well, I'll take up several of the things that you asked. First on say and relief of the poor. Smith is very clear throughout the book that the objective is to raise the living standard of the broad bulk of the population and to alleviate poverty. That's what he's trying to do. Incidentally, this is something that he got from from Hume. The Hume was his intellectual mentor. If we go back say a half a century before the Wealth of Nations, when people used the word wealth, what they meant was they would have said the wealth of the nation was the quantity of silver and gold specie in the coffers of the treasury. But the idea of Hume was that we should mean by wealth the standard of living of the population. And so when Smith wrote this, in effect, a how to do it book called The Wealth of Nations, what he was after was improving the standard of living of the broad bulk of the population. There are all these statements in the book about how no society can be deemed to be happy and successful if the majority of the working public are poor and miserable. It goes on and on about this. And so it's quite straightforward. He thinks the rich use their money foolishly, and it would be much better to tax their money and use it for relief of the poor. So it's pretty straightforward. On the banks, it's a very interesting story. In 1772, the Scots experienced the worst banking crisis in 2 generations. Widespread industrial bankruptcy, lots of bank failures, unemployment. Think of it as very much like our experience of 10, 12 years ago. The 2008, 9, 10 financial crisis was the worst banking crisis we'd had in the West since the 1930s. And Smith was very influenced by that. In fact, it's very amusing. If you look in the volume of Smith's correspondence, you see there's this wonderful letter from Hume to Smith in 1772. And Hume is relating all of these bankruptcies and all of the problems in 1772, including, as he puts it, suspicion of the Bank of England. And then at the end of this long paragraph describing all of the troubles, he says, and of course, Hume knows that Smith is writing a book. He says, do these events affect your theory? Well, they certainly did. They certainly did. And so the passages on banking and the call for these regulations were Smith's reaction to the banking crisis of 1772. So, Smith was a very practical man, and he was interested in the broad welfare of the working public in the same way that we are today. I mean, in effect, we get it from him, but he got it from Hume.
There's one question which maybe needs a little clarification, and then I'll come to this one of the other questioners. There's a question on how did religion affect capitalism in India. I mean, my point was that religion was kind of separated from the intellectuals, and it did not affect because we went into something called secularism, where religion was not part of the intellectual environment or the economic, and we picked a non-religious religion, so to say, which was Marxism or socialism. Anyway, I'm not sure. I don't know if Professor Friedman, you want to take a stab at that, but I don't know. Otherwise, I'll go to the questioner. There is Mr. Nebu Abraham wants to ask something. Do you want to ask a short question, Mr. Abraham?
Yes, sir. My question is relating to the Western experience of from the point where professor has discussed the question. The thing is, from Lutheran point of view and Calvinism, grace through salvation was the main point, which was discussed as part of Enlightenment. Now, how do you interpret grace by merit? Actually, what we see as individualism from the point of view that is discussed in the Wealth of Nation as self-interest is individualism. So, do you think that it has a connection with grace by merits?
Well, Calvinism is the opposite of grace by merit. The key phrase in Calvinism that's often repeated is unconditional election, meaning that one is your unconditional grace. The grace is not conditioned on anything that a person does in his or her lifetime. It's not conditioned on any merit that the person exhibits. And in the book, I give lots of examples of Calvinist preachers who made very clear that says, even if you discover that you are among the elect, you should absolutely not think that this is due to any merit on your part. And even if you are among the elect, you are no more deserving than somebody who is not. For the Calvinists, the grace is simply an undeserved, unmerited, unconditional, arbitrary action of the divine. And this, of course, leads to all sorts of questions about why they thought that. And this goes back to before Calvin, goes back to Augustine, and before Augustine, it goes back to Paul's letters to the Romans. And there's a long background that I give. But we want to think of Calvin's ideas as the exact opposite of grace by merit. Now, how does this connect to individualism? It really doesn't in terms of economic thinking. Max Weber famously argued that it did connect to individualism in a way that isn't part of my story. The Weber idea is that Calvinist believers were in a state of what Weber called existential anxiety, not knowing whether they were among the elect or not. And therefore, according to Weber, people were desperate to see signs of their election, and they interpreted certain features of behavior like being thrifty, like working diligently, and so forth, certain forms of individual behavior as external signs of election. And therefore, the Weber hypothesis, which is quite different from mine, is that for all these Calvinist believers, these various forms of individualistic behavior were prompted by the anxiety associated with their belief in Calvinism. But that's a very different story than mine.
Thank you, Professor. I have one more question on grace. When you see the concept of grace, it embed a kind of collectivism as well. So, how do you
say?
Collectivism? Grace could also mean collective responsibility of social responsibility or something like that. So, how do you see the grace as a collective responsibility of individual?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think for these people, again, going back to Paul's letters, grace is a word that first appears in Paul's letters to the Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. And grace is an individual concept. Again, I think it's chapter 8 and chapter 13 of Romans. It's clear that it's an individual idea, not a social idea. Now you can, time ago, and lots of people have used the word grace in various ways, but for the progression of thinking from Paul to Augustine to Calvin to then the post-Calvinist preachers, it's very individualistic.
Thank you. Thank you. Acha, next, Miss Joplin Heck, you want to ask? You have a good question. You want to ask your question? Unmute and ask. All right. You're muted. You have to unmute. Otherwise, I'll have to ask.
Sir,
go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I'm from Northeast, sir. Shillong. So the question is very, like, here in our state, Christianity has an impact. Sir, could you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Christianity has brought in many changes, especially in the market system. But till now, we never knew that it is associated with economics. So my question is on does capitalism influences culture if one looks at the Indian society with a multi-dimensional kind? So, sir, can you explain to it? Does it have an impact with capitalism and culture?
So treat it as a general question, not necessarily on India, Professor.
Yeah, look, I'm an economist and I'm very comfortable, therefore, with notions of two-way causation. So for example, in my book on the moral consequences of economic growth, the book was primarily about the way in which economic growth affects these aspects of society that I interpreted in moral terms, but I was very sympathetic to the idea that the causation goes the other way also. I have chapters on that, and similarly in this book, I chose to, because I was interested in the origins of economic thinking, I chose to write a book about the way in which religious thinking influenced economic thinking, including capitalism. But I'm also very sympathetic to the idea that economic thinking feeds back and influences cultural thinking, including religious thinking. And I have some elements in the book on that as well. This is not a new idea. I think of people like Daniel Bell, among sociologists, among historians. There's an American named Mark Howe. In an earlier era, R.H. Tawney, the English historian. So the idea that the capitalist economic development, or for me, economic thinking, has a reverse effect back on the religious thinking. It's a perfectly acceptable idea, and I talk about it a little bit in the book. that isn't what the book is primarily about causation in the other direction.
Okay, thank you. Charan, I don't see any more questions. How do you want to? Charan?
I think it's already past 7:30, and our normal time is around an hour, and the professor has really been kind, having taken the questions even beyond the time that we had requested him. So I think we can conclude here now. I want to thank the professor, want to thank Dr. Arvind Virmani to chair the session. And I must say that though in 2003, when I first met Professor Friedman at Harvard, when I was at IMF in Washington, I had the privilege to go and enjoy a breakfast with him a couple of times. Always, as Dr. Virmani said, he is a first-rate economist, been there at Harvard for such a long time. But then the human side of Professor Friedman is also exemplary. And that is so visible in the type of themes that he chooses for his books and the way he explains to the audience about what his book is all about. That's exactly that was visible, so clearly visible even today. So I must thank Ben Friedman to have accepted the invitation right at the outset and agreed to do this for us. I'm going to seek another appointment with him. I want him to speak to our audience at some point on inflation targeting and monetary policy.
Of course.
Something which Professor has been writing, and he is helping me reach out to other people who've been working on these things. So
yes, you're right. You remind me, that was some of the innovative work he did. I still remember that. Yeah.
Exactly. So, Professor, thanks for this day today. But whenever is convenient for you, we would like you to come and speak to us on IT. I would just like to tell you we have completed 5 years of inflation targeting in India. Different people have had a different view. I was of the view it's not suitable for India, but it was done in India. And now this month, the month of March, we are under review of inflation targeting. We do not know what the parliament and the government is going to talk about, but we would like you to come back to us and tell us the way you handle things from the fundamental principles to the latest. We would like you to, at some point of time at your convenience, April or May or June, we would like you to please spare a Friday like this as you did today, an hour, and talk to us and our audience about inflation targeting.
Well, I'd be glad to do that, and I would be honored to come visit in person in your institute next time I'm in India. But I think what you're doing in this new initiative is wonderful, and so I wish you all the best of luck with it. I think it's a great contribution to India, and I hope to economics more generally. So lots of good luck with it.
Thank you so much. Now, Professor Friedman's talk today will be available on our website in about 12 hours, and we will send the link to the professor as well as put it on the Twitter.
Please, thank you.
Next week, we are going to have a discussion on inflation targeting by Professor Pulapre Balakrishnan, and this is at 5:30 to 6:30 our standard time. And on Saturday, we are having another talk, which is March 19, Pulapre, and March 20, Professor Ashima Goel from IGIDR. She is going to speak on inflation targeting. So Friday 5:30 and Saturday 6:30 p.m. I would request all of you, if you can spare time, and listen to the discussion on inflation targeting. With this, let me conclude. Thank you much. Forward to all the meetings that we have for the next weekend, both the meetings that we have next weekend. Thank you very much.